On December 9, 1979, an international commission of scientists declared that smallpox had been eradicated from the earth. Considered the deadliest disease in history, for thousands of years it had terrified humanity. In the 20th century alone, smallpox killed over 300 million people. But when did smallpox originate? And how was it finally stopped? Smallpox is highly contagious and deadly, killing about 30% of those infected. It may go back thousands of years, perhaps as far as 10,000 years ago. In fact, many believe that Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V died of the disease in 1145 BC. Modern research, however, indicates that smallpox may be younger, possibly developing as recently as 500 years ago. By the 16th century, a type of inoculation for smallpox had developed in China, where a person would be infected with a weakened version of the disease that caused milder symptoms and resulted in future immunity. This inoculation was primarily administered using dried powdered smallpox scabs that were blown into the nostrils. Smallpox came to the Americas with the arrival of Europeans. The disease devastated the New World's indigenous peoples, killing at least 50% and maybe as much as 90% of the population. During the American Revolution, General George Washington's troops, most of them isolated from the disease for generations, faced a real risk of a devastating smallpox outbreak. The British Army, on the other hand, enjoyed herd immunity thanks to regular epidemics in Europe. On the advice of military surgeons, Washington made the daring decision to inoculate his troops against smallpox, many of them during the winter at Valley Forge, using a relatively new method that had never before been implemented on such a large scale. Rather than chancing that the men could catch the respiratory form of the disease, pus from infected patients was harvested and introduced directly into the men's bloodstreams through cuts on the skin. This inoculation did end up killing about 2% of Washington's soldiers, but a respiratory smallpox outbreak could have wiped out half his army. It was a brutal yet bold choice that played a real role in America's eventual victory. In 1796, English country doctor Edward Jenner discovered the first vaccine for smallpox. Jenner purposely infected patients with the much milder disease cowpox, which provided immunity from the related disease smallpox. In fact, the word vaccine comes from the Latin word vacca, which means cow. Smallpox vaccination efforts in Europe and the US began in the 19th century and continued into the 20th. Since the smallpox virus lives only in humans, eradication was simpler than from most other epidemic diseases like polio or malaria. The last US outbreak of smallpox occurred in 1949. In 1967, the World Health Organization began a worldwide effort to identify and stamp out the last remaining outbreaks of the disease. By the mid-1970s, it was only present in the Horn of Africa and parts of the Indian subcontinent. The world's last naturally occurring case was diagnosed in Somalia in 1977. With the 1979 declaration, smallpox became the only infectious disease afflicting humans that has been fully eradicated. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1831, German Jewish financier and philanthropist Baron Hirsch is born in Munich. In 1835, Texas takes possession of the town of San Antonio during its War of Independence. In 1917, during World War I, Ottoman forces surrender the city of Jerusalem to the British. In 1965, A Charlie Brown Christmas makes its TV debut, featuring jazz music by Vince Guaraldi. In 1990, Lech Walesa wins a landslide victory to become the first directly elected Polish leader. In 1992, British Prime Minister John Major announces the formal separation of Charles and Diana. In 2023, Shohei Ohtani agrees to a 10-year, $700 million free agent contract with the Dodgers. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. Who won the first ever Nobel Prize in Physics? Guglielmo Marconi, Wilhelm Röntgen, Albert Einstein, or Niels Bohr? Liked learning about the end of smallpox? Then you'll enjoy this one about the fight against another deadly disease, polio. Tap the screen to keep the story going on Today in History.